Welcome to another edition of HSF Conversations, the video podcast offering of the Hell with Society Forum, where we discuss the intersection of theology, spirituality, ministry, and culture. I'm an associate editor and senior contributor, Phillip Morgan, and today I'm delighted and honored to talk with Dr. Carrie Gress. Dr. Gress is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. She holds a Ph.D. in philosophy from the Catholic University of America, where she also serves as a scholar for the Institute of Human Ecology. She has written 10 books and numerous articles for outlets such as Fox News, The Daily Wire, Newsweek, the American Spectator, and many others. She is also a co-editor for the online women's magazine Theology of Home, and much of her writing focuses on women's lives and their essential role in society from a confidently Christian and specifically a Roman Catholic position. And like my wife and my mother, she's also a homeschooling mother of five, which I'm sure she would agree is by no means the least of her joyous labors and as well. So we're so thankful to have you with us today, Dr. Gress.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's really a delight to be here with you.
Yes, well, thank you. I've been wanting to talk to you for a little while. We've been discussing setting up a meeting. Last fall, I came across an interview that you were giving about your most recent publication, The End of Woman,
Mhm.
which I highly recommend. The End of Woman was published in 2023 through Regnery Press. And this is an excellent introductory history of feminism, in which you show how the seeds of 20th century feminism, second, third, and fourth wave feminism, as it's often referred to, they're all present in the work of the earliest feminists of the 19th century. And you start with Mary Wollstonecraft, and you work through going forward, showing how there is an intentional attack on the patriarchy of practicing free love, of embracing that, and embracing the occult and spiritism in rejection of Christianity. And so you were, I thought that history was particularly prescient and very well done and very accessible for the average reader. And so I was very excited to see that, in particular because I think, as you have noted and many others have noted, that in our current situation, there are lots of Christians, lots of conservative Christians even, who they're very happy to say 20th century feminism, Betty Friedan, Kate Millett, Simone de Beauvoir, they are so far away from biblical Christianity that they don't really make a defense for it, but that 19th century feminists tend to get something of a pass or even celebrated in ways. And my study of those 19th century feminists had led me to think, I think there's more going on here. And so I was so excited when I found your book because I felt like it really put all those truths at a very accessible level. And you did a lot of research to bring those things together. And so I was very glad to find that book. So maybe what I would like to begin with, though, is the question that I think we all have to address first off when we start talking about feminism and critiquing it
Mhm.
is, could you offer an explanation in brief why opposition to feminism is
Mhm.
not the same thing as being opposed to women's value as image bearers of God,
Mhm.
their value as members of society, or their civil rights?
Yeah, well, I think that's a really great question. And I think that that's one of the hardest pieces to talk about because so many of us have come to believe that feminism is what gave us those things. And in fact, it came from Christianity. I mean, there's never been a greater force for women's good than Christianity. Obviously, we see this in the life of Christ in very biblical ways. But it also came through, devotion to Christ's mother, and the honor that she was given throughout the centuries. And, I think just really this equal dignity that women have obviously comes from Christianity, and that is really the source of it. As you alluded to it, things get really interesting, of course, when you add feminism to it, because I think so. We've been told that that's really where our equality has been achieved, and in fact, it's hugely problematic to start digging into that. But so I use feminism in a very specific way. I think this is one of the struggles that we have talking about feminism is we don't define what we mean. We just sort of use it blithely. And, I continue to be amazed at people that are critical of my work, but they're not defining feminism themselves either. They're just sort of using it in this generic way, usually in a very kind of beneficial way. And so when I, wrote this book, I thought I've got to be very specific about what I mean by feminism. And, that doesn't preclude the fact that there could potentially be people that are using feminism in a radically different way, as long as they define their terms. But yeah, so what I really landed on as far as a definition of feminism that I use, because I think it does go back to the early 1800s, is this idea of those three things that you sort of already mentioned. One of them is free love, or getting rid of monogamy and the family. The other one is certainly the occult and these layers of spiritualism, especially in women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And then, of course, up to contemporary women, you can see this, rife in celebrity culture, is just how much the occult is now embedded in our elite women. And then the third one is this idea of egalitarianism, or smashing the patriarchy. That's what it's come to be known as, getting rid of any kind of hierarchy, whether it's a church hierarchy or a military hierarchy, just collapsing society into this very sort of socialistic, communistic sense of people are sort of interchangeable workers or cogs in the machine. And I think, those three pieces are really what I argue for in the book, is they've been there from the very beginning. And this is what I think at its core feminism is. Now, of course, again, there's all kinds of offshoots, and there's all kinds of women that wrote things that were very lovely and honorable and good. And I didn't, this is not a book that chronicles the entirety of feminism. It was very specific in terms of its goal. And so I think that was really what I was just trying to see, was can you make the claim that this thread of feminism that we see now really had some early roots. But I think one other piece that was really fascinating to research and to see this kind of connective tissue between these eras, was to really look at this question of how did women view men. And this is, one of the earliest points of, Mary Wollstonecraft and thereafter, is this idea that men had easier lives than women did. I was just reading a novel of Mary Wollstonecraft's, and, in it, there's this lament of a child is born a girl, if only she were a man. So I think that that's another really significant animating piece of the feminist movement, is this question: how do we make women more like men? Because there's this belief that men have a better, easier life. And then, when you start asking that question and you look at this whole trajectory of, over 200 years of feminism, suddenly the trans question doesn't seem so confusing, because if you've been telling women they're going to be happier like men, especially in the last 50 years, we've held up this model of empowerment that's very masculine for women, and at the expense of our fertility and even the question of motherhood, what it means to be a mother. Those kinds of things have really led to, so many of us thinking in very masculine terms about who we are as women. And this is why we can't define what a woman is, because we've become so confused by it. So that's kind of I think in a nutshell, some of the main foundational pieces that were in the book, and I think animate it and make it sort of clear to see all of these things as a whole, instead of just random things that popped up over the centuries.
Yeah, I thought that was one of the one of the strengths of your book, was showing how, with Mary Wollstonecraft, at the very earliest kind of feminist writer, even though she doesn't call herself a feminist, but very clearly they're all drawing from her thinking, is that she's arguing for defining woman as an abstracted human being rather than as unique, distinct genders, and she sees that as inherently making women less. And one of the things that is also very good about your approach is that you give biographical sketches of these women.
Mm-hmm.
And she had reason to feel like that women in her life had really been taken advantage of by men.
Yeah.
And so that plays into our thinking, but that doesn't mean that perhaps when we take into account their biographies, that also makes us say, well, we can understand why they may have come to this position, but that may not mean that they're the most trustworthy witnesses.
Yeah.
Because they may have a skewed perspective. So one of the things that you mentioned in your comment about how feminism has come to really dominate our popular culture and all of the major, especially female, but even male culture leaders and icons, they toe the line on feminism no matter what. And so one of the things that I found particularly fascinating about your book was not only does it trace the intellectual development with your background in philosophy, that would be kind of, a very straight line to your work, but you also talk about the mechanisms of pressure in our culture,
Mhm.
and I thought of Douglas Murray's work, the British s- journalist and writer, in his book, The Madness of Crowds. And he talks about feminism along with a number of other issues as being these cultural tripwires that no one can cross without, suffering really catastrophic public damage.
Mhm.
And that it's become a major part of our warfare. That Could you, for just a minute, talk about those mechanisms of pressure that particularly young women feel that they, if at all costs, they must say, I'm very pro feminism and all of that. Why is it that there are those pressures there in our culture and society?
Yeah. No, I think that's a huge question, and really one of the key pieces why I've done this research, because I'm just fascinated by this lockstep that women have. I mean, you can see it in the culture that there's, Taylor Swift is sort of the perfect example. Like, why is she what is it that she's promoting? It all fits in exactly with what everybody else has been promoting. All these celebrity women, there's no original thought or thinking. It's all very contained. And so yeah, I think it's much of it goes back, of course, to communism. And this, I spent a lot of time researching communism, researching the ways in which it has been implemented in the culture, especially compared to in the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, you have the Bolshevik Revolution. After that, women are forced into the workplace. Their children are sent somewhere else. The family is really dissolved in a lot of respects. Like, men and women were not given the same days off. Husband and wives were not given the same days off. So there was no sort of leisure time together. And yet abortion is one of the things that just has to be there. It's got to be on hand. And because you can't have women being the ideal worker if they're still bearing children. And I think the people the people that were promoting communism understood that you couldn't use that same model in the United States, and you had to make it appealing. And this is really where Betty Friedan came in. I mean, it was really interesting to study Friedan, because I knew some of her background, but I didn't know very, the bigger picture of it, and how she really, for years she had just said, really her whole life, that she just kind of stumbled upon the women's movement, and she wasn't really that interested in it until the 50s. And there's a great book actually written by a man who was a friend of hers that was trying to actually say, like, isn't it amazing what Betty Friedan was able to do with communism despite McCarthy? Like, she got around him, like this was his point. And, not realizing that it was really, in a lot of ways made Friedan look very bad, because you realize that she was a communist for a very long time before that. And so I think her book, The Feminine Mystique, is kind of really the touch point of seeing how this psychological warfare was used against women. Again, she's got this story spun about how she sent out a survey to her former alumni women from Smith College, and getting their responses to how they felt about being stay-at-home moms. And it all feels very plausible and explainable. But what most people don't realize is she's actually using in that work some of the main ideas that were part of the Soviet propaganda
Mhm.
that she was exposed to in this group called the Congress for American Women. So she actually calls the home a comfortable concentration camp, which just blows my mind that even made it into print, that you could call home that. But I think it shows just the deftness with which Friedan was operating, because she understood the a woman's mind and the ways and what things that motivate us. And one of them is that sort of fear of missing out, or that idea that there's something better out there that we don't have part of. You see this with Eve, even it goes all the way back to Eve. She wants more. So that, I think, was really the start of it, sort of the psychological shift of telling women that the home is a bad place and you should feel miserable there. And it was very, very successful. And the other thing that she had going for her is that was the beginning too of women not having had the experience of knowing how to be homemakers. And so, I know in my own life, I didn't know how to be a homemaker. I spent most of my free time playing tennis, just like cooking. So when you then take a woman and have her stay home with her children, it's very hard, just even on a practical level. And so that was another area where Friedan was very had a lot of leverage. But so yeah, it just, moving forward, you can see someone like Gloria Steinem. I mean, Gloria Steinem is sort of a marketing genius. She was very attractive. She was very articulate, and she was able to make these, she called homemaking and taking care of others codependency. It was just incredible what she was able to convey to people. But it was also the use of things like television. TV was just coming into fashion, and they were just really, the feminists were really crafty and careful about what it is that they were presenting, the ways in which they presented the material to make it always look very appealing and attractive. And then on the flip side, always a caricature of what that stay-at-home mom looks like. And this is one of the things that I deal with almost daily. People have this sense of, oh, you're saying women shouldn't work. And I've never said that. I'm working. That would be hypocritical for me to say that. What I'm saying is we need to recapture the maternal, which is not just biological, it's also psychological, it's also spiritual. Women are meant to mentor and shelter, love, nourish other women. I mean, and people, children. This is really the fundamental call, and that can be expressed in the home, or it can be expressed in the workplace. It can be expressed anywhere. So I think that's been the really interesting thing, is to just see how they've set up this binary of, this is how the savvy woman looks, and this is how the doormat looks. And this is why every time there's a political issue or a Supreme Court case or something, those women in the red robes from The Handmaid's Tale are trotted out and presented as, this is what's going to happen to us if we get rid of any kind of restriction on abortion, or whatever the issue is. So it's fascinating to see just how successful they have been in terms of and I call it branding the movement, and changing with the times and making it feel relevant. And this is what the cool women are doing. And women, we know, are very susceptible to trends and fashions, and we think of it as a good thing when it comes to clothing, but we don't realize that this is being used on our minds, highly effectively every day, all day long.
Yeah, so one of the things that I was struck by is the way in which you noted how popular media has been used to really,
Yeah.
really emphasize this kind of ideal of women as disconnected from the family unit, period,
Yeah.
from a committed long-term monogamous relationship with men, and then to have children is only seen as a barrier. And so I got to thinking, I mean, so you talk about Helen Gurley Brown's work with Cosmopolitan, how she very intentionally models that on Hugh Hefner's work at Playboy,
Mm-hmm.
and trying to separate out this sense of femininity or womanhood from that family monogamous relationship. But that's also in some ways kind of coming out of, that, Friedan says, I did this survey of women that I went to college with, but
Mm-hmm.
that would also have been an element of the emphasis in higher education, as more and more women are going into universities and colleges, that their university and college training was only valuable if they then went into a full-time career.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of these young women who had gone to university and college, and they had been told, this is for your career, your career, your career. And then if they end up caring for children and doing work on the side, even, that felt like somehow they had wasted all of that time and money. And it was a very non-holistic way of understanding that education process as well, and the
Mm-hmm.
development of the mind for lots of other areas, and how that could even be poured into the family unit.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess one of the other things that I was struck by as we were going through this is, um, the good of homemaking itself.
Mm-hmm.
The feminists look at it as a form of bondage, and a being completely limited, and certainly there are a lot of struggles that come with that. I talking with my wife, talking with my sister, who has 3 small children, and other women, especially when you have small children at home, there are a lot of struggles and trials that come with that. A lot of very sleepless nights, or very little sleep, A lot of daytime, especially being just with small children who you're carrying on very different kind of conversations than you would in other places. And so there is a lot of times where there's a certainly in the media, but yeah, I think there's also a temptation to just talk about that as a form of bondage or of a problem that we ought to get around. And one of the things that I thought was fascinating is that in uh, that you talk about the fact that this is also a way of spiritual development for women as well, going through this,
Hmm.
and that trial is also a means by which God works out His grace in us. And it
Hmm.
just blew me away because I thought about in the male context, I know talking to young fathers, it's a regular conversation where we will talk and we'll say, "Yeah, I thought I was grown up until I held my first child." And there's a lot of young men who will say that the moment they held that first child of theirs, all of a sudden they started saying, "I have all these things in my life I have to get together," and that is a development of themselves and maturity. And so I was just wondering, do you think that women kind of perceive that as purely bondage or something to be gotten around of? Is that a reflection of that feminist influence in our pop culture?
Hmm.
Have you found any examples of women previously talking about how that is an important development for,
Hmm.
spiritually for women as well?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question, and one of the things that I think gets very little attention. But I want to, we've gotten to this place where we don't know what a good woman is anymore. I mean, we can't even really define what a good woman is, but we have sort of this general sense that she's successful, she's independent, she kind of controls her own life, and but we also can see, and I've written about this as well. In terms of just the confusion that this creates of how do you actually grow up, how do you mature, how do you become less of a narcissist. I mean, and these are real issues that we have. Is just the narcissism that we are living with, and self-absorption that I think so many women think is just sort of the natural orientation in which we're meant to kind of live our lives. And so yeah, I think there is some other people who've written about this. Alice von Hildebrand is one. She's a was a Catholic philosopher at Hunter College, actually, really fighting the fight there, around so many people that were clearly opposed to anything that she had to say. But and this is one of the reasons why, and there are others, but I don't think that many people have written it within a contemporary context. And having gone through this myself, it was really fascinating. I actually have a book called Ultimate Makeover: the Transforming Power of Motherhood that I wrote. It's a small paperback. Um, but going into like how it is that we learn the virtues, how we grow in our character through motherhood. Because, when I had my first child, I just kept thinking, oh, well, next week is going to be easier. Next week will be easier. And of course, something new would happen next week, invariably. And I just finally, when I realized this was a feature, not a flaw of motherhood, then suddenly motherhood was much, much easier. And I realized what's happening here is I'm becoming less selfish. I'm becoming much more direct. My intentions, desires, interests are outside of myself and serving others instead of serving myself. And up until that point, I think I was almost 35 when I had my first child, and I had been living all over the world. Tons of flight miles. All of this. I had a much more interesting, engaging life on paper, and so it was really hard too. The bigger piece was even just finding community, I think this is one of the things that you hear a lot about from women is not only um, that it's hard, but you're also lonely. And then the culture scorns you as well. It's sort of isn't nobody's patting you on the back for like, thank you for raising these children and, rounding out the tax base for the future for,
Yeah.
all those kinds of things are
Yeah.
sort of missed. Um, but I think that, I looked at I looked at what's being attacked in the culture by feminism. And it's motherhood and it's virginity, any kind of the purity associated with womanhood, and of course, and like I said, motherhood. So when you look at that, you realize that these are kind of the two avenues through which women grew in maturity in the past. I mean, this is the beauty of Catholic tradition is we have so many religious nuns that we can look at, and saints and women, like Catherine of Siena and Joan of Arc and whatnot. Um, but I think that yeah, it's incredibly beautiful when you start comparing it with even like a monastery. Monks. My husband was a monk for 4 years in Italy before we met, so I have a pretty deep understanding of monastic life just from his own experiences and from reading about it. But this was the thing that was such a lesson for me, was just, when the monk hears the bell, he's got to stop what he's doing and move on to the next thing, no matter what it is, what stage he's at. And this is what happens with a child is you can't, the child starts crying, that's your bell. You've got to like start abandoning your own will. And, I think that is just one of those key pieces to start understanding what it means to love others and to serve others, and not in this weird codependent kind of way in which it's characterized. And that's really where I think it bears a lot of fruit when you start, you can see the examples of this when you start looking at women that you really admire. And it was interesting to look around at different women that I knew and sort of start trying to pick out, like, who were the wise women, who were the women that I wanted to seek out their advice, or I thought there was some prudence there. And so often it was women with a lot of children, because there's a lot to navigate in all of that. And there's a lot of self-surrender, and there's a lot of, pouring yourself out for others. And I think that's really where, the Christian model is. This is what Jesus did for us, was pour himself out. And that's what we're called to do. And I think there's also the other surprising thing that struck me just on a personal level, was the amount of joy that I found when I finally surrendered over to that and realized, this is my job. These are the people that need me. And this is the way in which I'm called to live like Christ. And that, suddenly there was this kind of joy that I had never experienced in my life before, which I think was the real fruit of it too. So yeah, I think we really have been short shifted in terms of what we've been told will make us happy, because this idea and the ideal of work and the independent woman will never make us happy. And we see this borne out in all the statistics showing women are less happy now than they were before feminism. And that's precisely because of the fact that we're being offered something that isn't in accord with our human nature. And that's where the misery, the depression, all of these things are sprouting from.
Yeah, and I think you highlighted that there's a lot of loneliness, a lot of feeling isolated that comes along with especially motherhood of young children. And
Yeah.
part of that has also struck me is, and to some degree, this is where the feminists are addressing of the 19th century. They are recognizing serious problems
Yeah.
in the new societies that are coming out of the Industrial Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
They're being separated from their husbands for now all day. And early on, we're talking like, 14-hour work days.
Yeah.
And sometimes their husbands are working 6-7 days a week. This is before women enter into the workforce in the same ways. They're feeling very isolated. And then in our current situation, it's become even more partitioned out in that we live far away from each other. So moms of young children oftentimes are not seeing each other on a regular basis, not engaging in, the normal craft work of the home and all of that as a group. There's not intergenerational support a lot of times. And really you need all of those things to be in place for it to really to be a less isolating kind of problem. And so I think when we're talking about how to address these things, we do need to recognize that, we live in a different society than our great grandparents did. And that might actually be a better way to go about it, would be like those great grandparents, but we're also having to deal with the situation we have on the ground right now. And so as I was thinking through, those struggles that we currently face today, and the real problems that these women were trying to address in the 19th and in the 20th century to some degree. One of the things that you've noted is that, and we began this by saying, just because we could be critical of feminists doesn't mean that we're arguing that women should not engage in higher education or careers or those things. And that I think is also very scriptural. I think that the Bible's very clear about, the woman depicted in Proverbs 31 is she's caring for her home, but she's also engaged in business and in trade. And she is respected throughout the city because of her wisdom. And that isn't just related to craft work, but also her intellectual wisdom. And so those things are not isolated, but maybe if we think about the way in which all those successes that we are glad for, that women now have increased access to education, They have the opportunity to go into various works, various forms of labor if they want to. They have property rights and access to easier forms of divorce. And, divorce is not something that we want to encourage, but there are some extreme examples where, that just may be the only solution that would be best. But what are some ways, have you thought maybe how, if we approach those good things that we think are good for women to have from a perspective that's not grounded in feminist thought, would they look qualitatively different in any way? Or would they look roughly the same? Or would it be slightly different?
Yeah, no, I think this is a really great question because we just haven't even seen any kind of models of what this could actually look like because of course, the media has been so um, anxious to sort of present this feminist idol. And so we don't really know what that looks like. And that's one of the things that my colleague Noelle Maring and I have done with our books, Theology of Home, is try to show like what does this actually look like with visuals. We have a lot of imagery in it and really rich content about what it means to be a woman and how do we live this out, and we even have pictures of men who look competent, which you never find in the media today.
That's right.
So I think it's a matter of sort of reforming our imaginations of how this looks. And the nice thing is that it feels like, I know I experience this a lot. There's a lot of families who are living this out, that they're recapturing what it means to be a family and to serve that family unit and flourish as a family instead of just as individuals within the family. So I think that that's a really important thing. Even trying to I actually just watched a video about Audrey Hepburn with my husband. We were watching this documentary the other night, and it was really interesting to just see, like, here's a woman that at the height of her career, she gave it all up because she wanted to be a mom. She tells a story about how she hated to be away from her son, and she would talk to him on the phone, and, he'd have a fever or something, and she just couldn't take it. She's thousands of miles away. And she just stopped, and she was really ever never able to regain her career. And then, of course, later on, she ended up becoming a spokeswoman for UNICEF, Goodwill Ambassador, I think she was called, which, no matter what, UNICEF has got issues. But the point being that she took this very seriously, and she traveled to places like Somalia. And, she was horrified by seeing children just dropping dead from starvation. But she used, like, it's fascinating to see how someone like Audrey Hepburn could go from different seasons of life, embracing this idea of being able to mother others and care for them. And her work with UNICEF, it was very sincere. She wasn't just being paid a lot of money and to be a pretty face. She's doing the hard work of going out and hugging children and looking them in the eye and being present to them. And I think that this is one of the things I feel like there's a lot of potential for women at this stage to go back and start looking at how do we integrate these things into our personalities and our lives in a compelling way. And a lot of it's already been done. I mean, if you look at how much homemaking, the pieces of homemaking are back in style. The word homemaking is not back in style, but pottery, sourdough bread, gardening, all the things that I know when I was growing up were certainly not popular. All these things are coming back into style. So it feels like people are really grasping for these things that feel very tangible and engageable and are practical, but at the same time, and kind of an art that each person has their own take on something. So I think that there's a lot of room for hope. I think the biggest challenge, though, that we really face is we just haven't been able to present women and what women really are in a way that's healthy and compelling. And so I feel like that, as Christians, is really our biggest obstacle, but also the biggest opportunity that we have right now, because people are hungry for it. They know it when they see it, and there's a richness there that they haven't gotten anyplace else. And that's been one of the fun things about like I said, the work that I've been doing at Theology of Home, is just how do you put all of this in a compelling and beautiful light? And even I've had people say when they got to the last chapter of my book, where I actually talk about these positive elements of womanhood, some women have said they've just cried through the whole thing because it was so beautiful, and there was something so compelling about it that they were just hungry for. So I think the hunger's there. We just have to find ways to start helping people see it in a healthier, compelling way.
Yeah, I think that that's absolutely right, that to get any sort of affirmation for embracing these traditional, um, historic, crafts of the home and of caring for the home, it's very rare. I know that for my wife, as she was working through, developing these skills of her own, working on those as a young adult woman and having a small child, and she's trying to work with that. She didn't see a lot of examples of how to do this or support in the culture or from women her own age. It has been interesting in the recent years. So we're kind of at the upper end of the millennials, um, the Gen Z generation. We've seen a lot more interaction with women who are way more interested in these things. And just like you said, uh, uh, the internet has a lot of terrible problems with it. But one of the things that it has allowed is that these are sub narratives in our
Mhm.
popular culture that are allowed to get some air and space.
Yeah.
And so she was able to find women who were engaging in sourdough making or in knitting or in quilting. We were thankfully able to early on in our marriage when we had a quilting circle in our local congregation.
Oh,
And
wow.
we were able to
Mhm.
connect with that, and it was a lot of women who were retired or, were just around the house, and they quilted and they shared that community, and she and I, when I was in youth ministry and I had, the days where I could do that, we would go and sit with them, and we would learn a little bit about the craft while also building those connections, and so, hopefully, we can see that beginning to build as we go forward, and, that makes me think of there's a 2020 interview that you did, with, I believe it's Dr. Grazie Christie and,
Okay. Mhm.
Mallory Millett, who is, an interesting story in her own right because she's Kate Millett's sister, and that's very fascinating. But I was really struck by your discussion with those ladies about the, um, the unique ability that women have to restore good culture in a society and a culture that's decaying and that is tearing
Mhm.
itself apart in many ways. And I
Mhm.
wonder if you could maybe expand on for just a moment the dichotomy between the sterility that comes out of modern feminist thought and its
Mhm.
connections even with the occult, because you make it very clear that it's very closely connected with the occult. That's one approach to it. And then the other side is the fertility of God's femininity that isn't just related to biological fertility, but that
Mhm.
women have this nurturing gift that
Mhm.
applies to all of creation in a really unique way. And I
Mhm.
wonder if you could just speak for a moment about that dichotomy between those 2.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm really glad that you brought up Mallory Millett because I was just thinking of her in the last question that you asked, and I forgot to mention it. But one of the things Mallory has talked a lot about is, feminism has given us this impression that we could only get these things that we have, education, the vote, et cetera, because of it. And this is sort of the grasp that it has on us. It's this kind of guilt that we feel like, oh, well, I have to be beholden to feminism because I wouldn't have had this degree without it, that kind of thing. And her whole point is feminism didn't have to destroy the whole culture in order for us to get these things. And I think that that's really a vital point because when you see what's the engine behind it, you do really realize it has destroyed the whole culture. It's because of the fact that it's targeting the family and, like you said, the occult elements. Um, so yeah, I think that there's a lot of, the homemaking piece is great. I think even just the awareness, women need to be aware that their body is the first home any person will ever live in. This is our body is a home. And I think that that's a really fascinating element because then it asks all kinds of questions about the body and the soul, the connections of the two, even, the way a woman cradles a baby in her arms. It's because our arms are formed in a different way than men's arms. If I hold my arm out, there's a bend in it. If you hold your arm out, it goes straight. It's those kinds of things that tell us a lot about who we are. And I think, again, this is where we see this disconnect between what women have been told that they are. We've been told that we're workers instead of being told that we're maternal, we're mothers. We have this capacity to care and love and shelter as a home, those people around us. And even, you think about that woman who has grown children, she's not still thinking about them. Is she not still praying for them daily, constantly knowing where they are, kind of aware of their presence, even if they're around the world, doing different things? Of course she is. They still live interiorly in her mind and heart. So I think these things, when we start really highlighting them, it becomes, light bulbs go on. Even the pet craze that we're experiencing right now, pets have gone from parents, or owners have gone from pet owners to now being called pet parents. And it just shows this desire that women have to parent, to mother something. And it's incredibly tragic that that's what's happened, because we've decided that our fertility is not important, but women still have this huge hole in their hearts for mothering something. And so now it's coming through the pet industry. We spent $700 million on pet costumes last year. It's pretty crazy when you start seeing what's happening there. Not that I'm not pro pet, but when we now have more pets than children in our homes in the United States. So I think that there's a lot of exciting ways that women really can restore the culture. I think actually it's incumbent upon women to start focusing on the issue of feminism and helping other women understand just the damage that it has done, because men will not do it. It's not that you can't do it. It's because feminism has been like kryptonite for men. Men don't want to talk about it. They feel like it's an argument they're never going to win. So I don't necessarily tell men that they have to engage in this. I love being, the support people like you and others who see the real issues with it. But as far as just everyday life, I think it really has to come from women who are saying, we don't want this anymore. This is not good for us. This isn't good for our families. It's been a disaster for our culture and civilization. We need to go back to something, or we need to rethink the way in which we understand womanhood. And I don't know that we can go back to the 1950s. I don't want to go back to the 1950s. I think there's a way in which we can look at this healthfully and in a compelling way, given our own age and just the way in which people are living today too. So, but I love that example of the quilting bee that you gave, because I feel like there is so much wisdom that older women have. And, I think a lot of older women feel like they're, just, what do they do with themselves? Where do their lives? And this is really, I think, a meaningful and very purposeful thing that I've encouraged a lot of women to do is, if you know how to make some kind of specialty cake, invite other women over, younger women, to teach them how to do it. And from there comes the community. From there comes the wisdom. There comes the sharing. And also just even that diminishment of the isolation, because so many of us don't live near family. I think there's a lot of incredibly beautiful and practical ways that women can use their gifts, their hands, their minds, for building the culture up very, very specifically, instead of, feeling like we're so helpless that we just sit and watch it, even on a very local level, whether it's just in the immediate family or, the local community.
That's right. Yeah, I've just been struck by again and again when I teach a civics course here at Welch College, and I always tell them, my students said one of the Enlightenment's false goals was that we could fix all these problems through grand schemes. That's not how we actually address social decay or problems, real social problems. It's through one person acting virtuously in their context, and every person doing that as much as they can. And so I think that women have a particularly excellent role. And I really appreciate your emphasis on women having a unique gift from God to be able to build culture, not just through, reproducing, having children, but also through just building those connections in the community, and for that a holistic view of seeing it in its totality. And so I really appreciate that. Well,
And I too, just a final thought on that is, just the importance of rich relationships. That's really what drives women. And, I think that this is something that can be done anywhere, that being dialed into somebody, knowing their birthday and care, being able to anticipate a need of somebody before they even know it, especially a child. I think that really, these are all really the unique attributes. So not that men don't have them, but I think that this is just such a special piece that, rather than feeling like there's something disordered about it, that it's some kind of mental illness or codependency or something, that we're interested in these things. We need to embrace them and use them and try to strengthen them, instead of denying them, which I think is what has really happened over the last 50 years.
Right. Well, I'm so thankful for you taking time to meet with us today and to share about your book. And I do encourage our audience to pick up The End of Woman. It is a great, excellent book and really introduces you to some of these ideas. I also encourage you to check out Theology of Home, the website that Dr. Gress helps to oversee, and it's got good resources for women as well. And is there anything that you're working on right now that you want to promote? What is your newest project that you're looking at?
Oh goodness, I'm still just working away on The End of Woman, and sort of dealing with a lot of, I mean, there's obviously going to be pushback on a book like this, and sort of trying to help people understand the nuance that's there. And I think the latest accusation is that I think that women are not rational, which of course, is hysterical, given that I have a PhD in philosophy. And nowhere in the book am I ever critical of rationality. So let that be
Right.
said out loud. But yeah, so but in the meantime, no, I'm still always working on about 17 different things at the same time. And it's the beauty and richness of life. And I think that's been the great thing about my career, is just being able to do something very deeply philosophical and then move into something much more practical. I'm actually writing an article about an art gallery right now. So yeah, I think there's a lot there for us that's beautiful and compelling, and it's really just such a privilege to be able to promote as much of it as I can.
Well, good. Well, we thank you so much for your work and thank you for your time meeting with us today.
My
We'll
pleasure.
see you. We'll see you all later at our next edition of HSF Conversations.